One dimension of semantics they can't handle is what philosophers call intentionality, which is a very misleading term. It has nothing to do with subjective experience. In philosophy, this means being about something. So connecting a word to something in the real world. The difference, which I gather exists, between representing the meaning of the word, which is done via these so-called embeddings, and representing a concept. So for starters, I mean, to me, the amazing part about these models begins with the representation of the meaning of words, because the models kind of invented the system for doing it, right? And and I want you to comment on that if you disagree. There is kind of nuance there, because they were, broadly speaking, the structure of what they do was given to them, but it didn't. Anyway, let me just say that a problem with the phrase stochastic parrots is that parrots can't paraphrase. All they can do is repeat exactly what you said. And to even get to the point where you can paraphrase something, which may not seem very impressive, you have to have a way of representing the meaning of words, right? You have to have this intermediate layer, semantic layer, that connects the word car to the word automobile or something. And uh, and so the machines do that by locating words in like vector space, and it turns. And by the way, there are people who think the human brain does it somewhat like this. I don't think we really know yet, but so if you imagine just a two-dimensional graph, and say we're plotting animals. Vertical is degree of lethality. Horizontal is speed. Okay, so you've got kind of tigers are high on both. You got kind of tarantulas high on one, low on one, rattlesnakes, and so on. So they're in different parts of that space. Now, these things map words in tens of thousands of dimensions or some just massive quantities. And they're not all semantic. I guess some are syntactic. But the point is, they get the job done that way. And I think that's the first thing to understand about these machines is that one phrase of Martine's was, it's just distribution in, distribution out. Let me read you a quote of his. All it's doing is learning structure in the text. It has nothing to do with underlying meaning. It's just structure that's in the text. You can understand the distribution of text. You can spit out text, but this doesn't say anything about learning fundamental principles of the world from which the text is based. Now, I think he may kind of be right about that. That's interesting, because John Searle in his Chinese room paper, the first thing he said was, well, he was talking about, he wasn't talking about anything like the current models, but he was a philosopher who back in the 80s or something mounted a famous argument that machines can't understand things. And he said they can handle syntax, but not semantics. And he further added that one dimension of semantics they can't handle is what philosophers call intentionality, which is a very misleading term. It has nothing to do with subjective experience. In philosophy, this means being about something. So connecting a word to something in the real world. So, and the argument I made in this piece is, well, with multimodal AI, you can now do that too, right? You can show the AI an apple in the real world and ask it what it is, and it'll tell you. So I think Searle's argument is dead. But at the same time, I think maybe Martine is right to say that if you're just talking about large language models, and I should say I'm not even sure that that's what he was talking about here, but I think he more or less, for practical purposes, was. If you're just talking about the processing of text, he's right that although there is one aspect of semantic representation they do handle, which I described, still the part about connecting it to the world, which for us is part of understanding something, right? They're not, if you're just doing a text, they're not doing that, right? Does that make sense?
I have no idea, I guess, is a short answer. I mean, I could tell you a lot of details about, tokenization, which is sort of how language is broken down into its bits, and the large language models typically have a finite vocabulary of distinct tokens that they parse language into as they ingest it. And that's usually like 50,000 or 100,000 different tokens. And then it's commonly understood that there's this process of de-tokenization where, a famous example that Neil Nanda, who's at DeepMind and just one of the, alongside Chris Olah and the Anthropic team, is, one of the titans of the young field of interpretability. He often uses the example of Michael Jordan, where both of those tokens, Michael and Jordan, I'm not even sure if Jordan, to be clear, is like a single token, or maybe that's two tokens, Jordan, or who knows, right? I haven't studied to that level to know exactly what the vocabulary is, but it's clearly multiple tokens. And yet somehow the model does understand that we're not just talking about, two random disassociated tokens, but actually knows like, okay, this is Michael Jordan, and then loads in through all these layers, all these associated concepts. So I think we're getting, and by the way, and talk about useful in engineering, really good paper out of the Bao lab, maybe a year or so ago, showed that they could even edit information inside a large language model post-training, train the whole thing as normal, then go in there and tinker with it in such a way where Michael Jordan could be made, per the model, to have played a different sport. And they can make those edits in a way where the response that, okay, Michael Jordan played some other sport instead of basketball, you could make that edit in such a way that it's robust to different ways that you answer the question. It doesn't apply to other basketball players, so Larry Bird and Magic Johnson and LeBron still all play basketball in this edited model. So we're getting decent at like even locating this information, figuring out how to edit it. I think I kind of don't know what it means in many of these cases when people say, okay, but that has nothing to do with meaning or has nothing to do with the real world. I mean, to me, it's like, it's clear that it has something to do with meaning, has something to do with the real world. I don't know how you would have such a rich representation of the world without having some relationship to the real world. But then I think the question is like, what is the nature of that relationship? And, what predictions can we make based on different theories of that relationship? And, how can we test those? And I do think we didn't quite get there in that conversation. So I'm not exactly sure how he thinks about that. I do think that robots are coming. I mean, if I was going to try to venture something that seems like it might really move toward a resolution of this debate, if, one thing you might say is, okay, sure, these things can spit out text and maybe they can even, take in imagery and spit out images. And yeah, maybe they can even take in audio and video now and respond coherently to all that sort of stuff. But they still can't. That's still, they still don't. I'm not sure what it means to say that has nothing to do with the real world, has nothing to do with meaning. But one thing it might mean is they're not going to be effective. They're not going to be able to actually move around the world. They're not going to be able to do things in a functional way. And to that, I would say, give the roboticists like 2 more years, and I would expect that we're going to see quite good robots. Already today, we've got robots that in the DeepMind case, and Meta's doing this kind of stuff too. And, OpenAI has a partnership in this, and Tesla's trying to do it with their robot. Already we have robots that can take verbal instruction, look around at their circumstances, and try to follow your verbal instructions. They're robust enough that they can kind of overcome perturbations. So there's a famous video from Google where the experimenter says to the robot, like, go pick me up that bag of chips and bring it to me. And the robot, follows the instructions. And then when it gets to the bag of chips, they knock it out of the robot's hand. And so now the robot, it's just running this loop of like, okay, what's my goal? What am I looking at? What should my next step be? And it's doing that, whatever, a couple times a second. All of a sudden the bag is out of its hand and it's like, I guess I better pick the bag up again. So this, this sort of thing repeats where it seems to have like a reasonably good robustness even to these sort of, perturbations. Now, if you knock the thing over, it's not going to be able to stand back up. Certainly it can still be confused. Like certainly it'll still drop the glass, more often than you would want it to, and spill things. So they're kind of clumsy, but I guess my expectation, one bet that we might make, or one, hypothesis that we might falsify is that I would expect that robots are going to get quite good over the next couple of years. And at that point, it starts to become hard to say, okay, well, what real world are they not connected to that that you really want them to be connected to?
And that kind of gets to this concept of intentionality. Like, in other words, it's one thing to represent the words in semantic space, as these models, I would say, do, multivectorial or whatever the term is, semantic space. It's another thing, and by the way, I gather they do, if words are ambiguous, like Apple the fruit, Apple the company, they're located in different places. And then the machines use context to determine which one of those they want to hone in on, right? But it's one thing to do that. What Searle would say, if he's emphasizing the quote intentionality, is, but you have to know an apple when you see one. Okay, that's a different matter. And a large language model in the narrow sense doesn't do that, but these multimodal models obviously do. And you can, well, it sounds like you made dissent from that. Go ahead.
No, I think that even that claim of you have to know one when you see one, I think that we just have a very sort of trapped sense of like what counts in many of these instances. So immediately came to mind, as we're doing classic thought experiments, what about a bat? If a bat flies around a room and emits its signal and gets a signal back and can identify an apple from that, like, does that count? I can't do that. Does that mean the bat has some way of knowing that I don't know? I would say, yeah, it does maybe have some way of knowing that I don't know. But I can also taste it. Can the bat taste it? Maybe it can, maybe it can't. I don't know if it has teeth to bite into an apple. So, I think there's just a lot of different ways of knowing, it seems. Looking around at the animal kingdom, I see just incredible diversity that is probably underappreciated. I do tend to think most of these animals are conscious in some sense. I have no idea really if language models are conscious or not. That's a whole other can of worms. But I just think there's often a very narrow concept. Well, one of my, I amused myself with this tweet, if nobody else, but I recently tweeted, it's only reasoning if it comes from the reasoning portion of the human brain. Otherwise, it's just sparkling brute force search. I think you could say something similar about understanding. Like, I understand in some way. It's not a universal understanding. It's not, I'm not one who believes in some, single overarching God that it would have the Platonic understanding. But if there is such a thing, clearly my understanding is not that. And yet it counts, it's functional. The bat's version is functional for it. The robot's version, if it's functional for it, like, I don't know on what basis we're going to still try to wall off and say they don't understand if they can do a lot of things. Right. And I don't think they have to do exactly the same things that we can do to be, reasonably understood as understanding. Understanding differently, perhaps understanding very differently. Perhaps as we open the black box, we'll find that, man, this is really weird and not at all how we thought it was going to work and totally counterintuitive. I think in general, less counterintuitive maybe than our worst fears. But I think then we're confronted with something where it's like, this becomes a different form of understanding. We can maybe develop different vocabulary words for that at that point. We could call it understanding star, or we could call it, AI understanding or whatever. But I think, if you imagine this sort of going back to your kind of, many, many dimensional conceptual space, what the robot is doing seems like it's in the general region of this vast conceptual space, nearby to where my version of understanding is. Certainly, there are many other things that are far, far more different from my understanding than the robot understanding. So I think it matters really to pin down those differences. I don't think we should jump to the other mistake would be to say, oh, it's just like us. I don't think we should jump to that conclusion either. But it's just like, we just have a lot of work to do to answer these questions. And unfortunately, they're probably not going to be answered with sentences. They're going to be answered with like metrics and a variety of different ways to try to get at the problem, which will still probably ultimately kind of feel incomplete, because just like we don't know what it's like to be a bat, we're probably not ever going to know what it's like, if anything, to be a robot, or at least I don't see any path to that right now. But again, that doesn't mean it's not understanding in some meaningful way.
Right. But I mean, as long as He brought up that phrase, what is it like to be a bat? That, of course, famous paper by the philosopher Thomas Nagel about consciousness. And among other things, it's a definition of consciousness. It basically says if it's like anything at all to be this being, then that being can be said to be conscious, have subjective experience, and so on. I want to emphasize I am intent on defining understanding independent of the question of whether there is consciousness or subjective experience. Because as you said, we just don't know what's going on in these machines. In the piece I wrote in Nonzero about the Searle thing, I tossed out this my own conception of understanding. I said understanding means processing information in broadly the way human brains are processing information when humans are having the experience of understanding. It doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter if the computer is having the experience, but if it's processing information broadly the way, and by broadly what I meant was like, so humans must have a system for representing the meaning of words. That is one element, not the only element of what we call understanding. If computers have such a system, then they have one element of understanding. That's the way I would put it. These LLMs clearly have that, and impressively, they kind of invented it. I mean, they came up. I don't want to get into details, and I suppose you could argue about how much creativity they exhibited, given the constraints on the way they work when they came up with this kind of multivectorial. They didn't come up with the idea of multivectorial. That was built into the machine. But so I want to emphasize, I'm not, and a lot of people just can't think about understanding without thinking about subjective experience. And I would say, fine, but I can't help you. I just don't, it doesn't seem to me to make sense to talk about this question if subjective experience is a prerequisite for understanding as we use the term.